At 7:33 a.m., the Persian Gulf was carrying its normal daytime traffic. The density of commercial shipping that moves through one of the world's busiest waterways under the specific pressures of an active military conflict in the surrounding region. Tankers, container vessels, bulk carriers, and general cargo ships were navigating the standard commercial routes, their positions transmitting on AIS, their movements logged in the maritime traffic management systems that the Fifth Fleet's Maritime Operations Center monitored continuously alongside the military picture. The commercial traffic had not stopped during Operation Epic Fury. It had thinned. Some vessels had diverted to alternate routes. Some shipping lines had suspended Gulf transits pending the conflict's resolution. Some insurers had pulled coverage for the zone. But the Gulf had not closed. The commercial vessels that were still transiting were doing so under the protection of the Maritime Security Corridor that the Fifth Fleet's surface combatants and maritime patrol aircraft had been maintaining since the conflict's second week. A system of escort arrangements, regular patrols, and responsive threat investigation that had kept commercial shipping moving through 3 weeks of conflict with the IRGC. The IRGC's maritime operations planners had been watching this commercial traffic with particular attention since the 4th day of the conflict. Not because they intended to disrupt it. The disruption of global shipping was a political liability the IRGC's strategic leadership was managing carefully, mindful of the international pressure that broad attacks on commercial vessels would generate. They were watching the commercial traffic because commercial traffic provided cover. A vessel transmitting a valid commercial AIS identifier, displaying the visual characteristics of a cargo ship, moving at a speed and on a course consistent with the commercial transit pattern, was not a vessel that the Fifth Fleet's surface combatants and maritime patrol assets would prioritize for close investigation. The Gulf contained, at any given time, between 40 and 70 commercial vessels. The Maritime Operations Center could not investigate everyone. The resources required to investigate every vessel in detail would overwhelm the available patrol assets and compromise the military missions those assets were conducting. The commercial shipping's volume and the military's limited boarding capacity created a gap. The IRGC's plan was built inside that gap. 3 vessels. Over a period of 18 days, 3 IRGC Navy operated ships, a converted general cargo vessel of Panamanian flag, a Dow-style vessel modified with below-deck weapon storage, and a small tanker whose cargo was not petroleum, had been positioned in the commercial traffic pattern of the central Persian Gulf. Each vessel carried a concealed weapons loadout. C-802 anti-ship missiles mounted on retractable launchers below the cargo deck, 23mm anti-aircraft guns concealed in cargo containers modified with hinged side panels, and a team of 14 IRGC Navy personnel in each vessel's below-deck compartments. The vessels were genuine commercial ships, acquired, modified, and crewed with the concealment of their weapon systems designed to pass the visual inspection of a maritime patrol aircraft or a surface combatant at standard engagement distance. They were not perfect counterfeits. They were good enough to be invisible in the traffic density of the Gulf, moving at commercial speeds, maintaining AIS broadcast, radioing normal traffic queries and responses through their commercial communications equipment. The plan called for the 3 vessels to close to within 3 miles of separate American surface combatants simultaneously, close enough for the C-802 to engage with minimum warning time, close enough for the deck guns to be brought to bear if the initial missile strike achieved anything less than the immediate incapacitation of the target. The simultaneous engagement of 3 American surface combatants from vessels disguised as commercial traffic was designed to produce the one thing the IRGC's planners assessed as the most strategically significant single action available to them: American military casualties at scale, delivered through a method that exploited the maritime law of nations' protection of commercial vessels and that would create a precedent of uncertainty about every commercial vessel in the Gulf. If 3 ships that looked like cargo vessels had attacked American warships, every cargo vessel in the Gulf became a potential threat. The maritime security corridor collapsed. The commercial traffic stopped. The economic pressure mounted. The strategic logic was coherent. The operational security was genuine. The 3 ships had been in the Gulf for 18 days. They had been in the Gulf for 18 days and had been under continuous intelligence observation for 11 of those days. The identification of the first vessel, the converted general cargo ship, had come not from its visual characteristics or its AIS profile, which were unremarkable, but from a signals intelligence collection event on day 7 of the conflict. The IRGC Navy's Maritime Operations Communications Network used a specific encryption system whose traffic patterns, not content, but traffic volume, timing, and node architecture, had been profiled through years of collection against the system. On day 7, a traffic anomaly had appeared. A communications node whose location corresponded to a vessel in the Central Gulf shipping lane was generating traffic patterns consistent with a tactical command post rather than a commercial vessel's navigation and port communications. The anomaly was small. It was unmistakable to an analyst trained to see it. The analyst flagged it at 9:17 p.m. on day 7. The flagged vessel's AIS position was cross-referenced with the commercial traffic database. The vessel's claimed identity was verified against shipping registry records. The registry was valid. The vessel's claimed history was consistent. Everything that could be verified through open-source data was verified and consistent. Everything that could not be verified through open-source data was suspicious. The vessel's acoustic signature, collected by a P-8A Poseidon during a maritime patrol pass at 3 a.m. on day 8, did not match the machinery noise profile of its claimed engine configuration. The discrepancy was small, a harmonic frequency in the ventilation system that suggested additional compartmentalized power generation below the standard machinery spaces. It was not conclusive. It was the second data point. The third data point came from a SEAL reconnaissance element that approached the vessel on day 9 under the cover of a routine maritime inspection conducted from a Mark 6 patrol boat. The inspection was conducted at the vessel's waterline, checking for maritime safety compliance, the standard cover for a closer look. The SEAL team's underwater swimmer, operating beneath the patrol boat's hull, photographed the vessel's below-waterline modifications, additional ballast tank structures in a configuration inconsistent with the vessel's declared cargo capacity, and, most significantly, retractable hull penetrations whose configuration matched the below-deck launcher geometry of the modified C-802 system. The IRGC had been observed testing at Bandar Abbas in the previous year. The 3 vessels were all identified within 4 days of the first one. The second was identified through a human intelligence source inside the IRGC's Maritime Acquisition Program. A source whose access had been developed over 14 months and whose reporting, when it arrived, described the vessel's general cargo designation and current position with the specificity that only someone with direct program knowledge could provide. The source described the vessel's modification, the retractable launcher system below the main deck cargo hold, the concealed deck gun positions built into standard-appearing shipping containers, the crew complement of 14 and their tactical training in the IRGC Navy's Coastal Defense Program. The third vessel was identified through the same acoustic profiling method that had flagged the first, a P-8A routine pass, that produced an anomalous machinery signature on a vessel whose declared engine configuration should not have produced it. The acoustic anomaly was smaller than the first vessel's signature discrepancy. The analyst who flagged it had been looking specifically for that pattern after the first 2 vessels were identified. She found it in 16 minutes of data review. On day 12, all 3 vessels were under continuous covert surveillance. Their positions were tracked. Their communications patterns were monitored. Their crew routines were observed through the Maritime patrol aircraft's sensor suites, operating at altitudes and ranges consistent with routine patrol rather than investigation. The intelligence picture was building toward the operational decision of how and when to address the threat they represented. The decision was not to address them immediately. The vessels were being watched. As long as they were being watched, they were understood. The moment they were addressed, the IRGC would know that this approach had been detected and would develop new approaches. The intelligence value of understanding what the IRGC was willing to do, understanding the operational concept, the weapons configuration, the crew sizes, the coordination pattern, had a value that exceeded the risk represented by 3 known, tracked vessels whose movements were fully characterized and whose every action would trigger a response that was already prepared. The vessels were watched. The response was readied. The command authority was briefed daily on the vessel's positions, movements, and any change in their activity pattern that would indicate imminent employment. At 7:19 a.m., 14 minutes before the engagement, that change appeared. All 3 vessels had modified their courses at approximately 7 a.m. Not dramatically, the course changes were within the range of normal commercial maneuvering. But the new headings, extended to their projected positions at 8 a.m., placed all 3 vessels on azimuths that would bring them within 3 miles of 3 specific American surface combatants by approximately 7:40 a.m. The 5th Fleet Maritime Operations Center received the course change alert from the surveillance network at 7:19 a.m. The watch officer compared the projected positions against the surface combatant positions. The comparison took 40 seconds. At 7:20 a.m., the watch officer reached for the authorization circuit. The command authority received the alert at 7:21 a.m. and confirmed the engagement authorization at 7:22 a.m. The authorization specified all 3 vessels simultaneous engagement before any of the 3 reached the 3-mile engagement threshold. 3 minutes later, at 7:25 a.m., the MH-60R Seahawk helicopters that had been repositioned to the patrol area on day 11, when the surveillance picture had become confident enough that pre-positioning response assets was justified without alerting the vessels, activated their targeting systems and confirmed their engagement assignments. Each helicopter was assigned 1 vessel. The Seahawk carries the AGM-119B Penguin anti-ship missile, a passive infrared homing weapon that requires no radar emission and therefore provides no warning to its target through electronic warfare detection. The Seahawk does not need to illuminate a target with radar to fire the Penguin. It sees the target thermally, acquires the infrared signature of the vessel's exhaust stack and machinery heat, and releases the missile. The vessel receives no electromagnetic warning. The first indication the target crew has that a Penguin has been fired is the sound of the missile's motor igniting above them, a sound that arrives with approximately 6 seconds of warning before impact. At 7:33 a.m., all 3 MH-60R helicopters fired simultaneously. 3 Penguin missiles in the air. 3 commercial-appearing vessels that had been attempting to approach American warships under the cover of their claimed identities. The Penguin's passive infrared homing seeker required no radar illumination and produced no electromagnetic warning to its target. The vessel's electronic warfare systems, which each vessel carried, buried in its below-deck electronics space alongside the IRGC tactical communications equipment and the weapons control systems, had nothing to detect. No radar emission, no laser designation, no radio command uplink. Just the infrared seeker looking at the heat of the exhaust stack and the machinery spaces below the waterline, computing its terminal approach and guiding the missile to the impact point with the quiet precision of a system whose physics do not require any cooperation from the target. The first Penguin impacted the converted cargo vessel at 7:33 a.m. and 47 seconds. The second struck the Dow-style vessel at 7:33 a.m. and 51 seconds. The third Penguin impacted the small tanker at 7:33 a.m. and 54 seconds. All three impacts were within a 7-second window. All three vessels were struck before any of them had reached the 3-mile engagement threshold that would have brought them within C-802 range of their designated American surface combatant targets. The C-802 launchers below their decks never retracted into firing position. The concealed deck guns never opened their container panels. The 14 IRGC Navy personnel in each vessel's below-deck compartments were below deck when the missiles hit. The three strikes produced different visual effects. The converted cargo vessel burned slowly. Its below-deck modifications had included additional fuel storage for the crew's extended deployment, and that fuel fed a sustained fire after the Penguin's warhead detonated. The Dow-style vessel broke apart rapidly, its lighter construction less able to absorb the warhead's structural damage. The small tanker, the one whose cargo was not petroleum, but which had been modified with propellant storage for the C-802 missiles, produced the most dramatic result. The Penguin's impact ignited the stored propellant. The secondary explosion that followed was disproportionate to the Penguin's own warhead by a factor that the post-strike damage assessment would note as indicative of substantial secondary explosive material aboard. The explosion was visible from the American surface combatants that had been the vessel's intended targets. The crews of those ships, who had not been told the nature of the engagement that had just protected them, watched the horizon to the south and saw, briefly, a fireball that had no immediately obvious origin. They noted it in their bridge logs as an unexplained explosion in the commercial shipping lane. They did not investigate. Their patrols continued. The MH-60Rs were already recovering to their host vessels. The Seahawk crews had performed their mission with the quiet professionalism that characterizes naval aviation in operations where the planning has been thorough and the execution has been prepared. The Penguins had found their targets. The targets had not had time to respond. The post-strike analysis that was completed at 9:44 a.m. was comprehensive in what it described and significant in what it implied. 3 IRGC Navy Q-ship operations, the modern equivalent of the armed merchant raider concept that had been used in naval warfare since the First World War, had been identified, monitored, and eliminated before they could complete their missions. The weapons aboard the three vessels, had they been employed at 3-mile range against their designated targets, would have represented a genuine threat to American surface combatants, operating under rules of engagement that presumed commercial vessels to be non-combatants until they demonstrated hostile intent. The IRGC's operational concept had been sound. Its execution had been careful. Its operational security had been good enough to keep the vessels unidentified for 7 days. It had not been good enough to keep them unidentified for 11. The response package extended beyond the 3 Q-ships themselves. The intelligence collected through 11 days of covert surveillance had produced a comprehensive picture of the IRGC Navy's Q-ship acquisition, modification, and staging program, the shipyards where the modifications were conducted, the coordination facilities that had managed the 3-vessel deployment, the IRGC Navy Maritime Special Operations Unit whose personnel crewed the vessels, and the command nodes that had directed the program. All of it had been cataloged. All of it was in the target package that the Night Watch Operations Cell had been building since day 11. At 7:35 a.m., 2 minutes after the 3 Q-ships were struck, the strike authorization for the full target package was requested. It was granted at 7:39 a.m. The modification shipyard at Bandar Abbas, the facility where commercial vessel hulls had been fitted with the concealed launcher systems, received 4 GBU-38 JDAM impacts from F/A-18Fs at 8:14 a.m. The dry dock infrastructure, the crane systems, and the specialized fabrication equipment that had installed the below-deck modifications were assessed as non-recoverable structural damage. The IRGC Navy Maritime Special Operations Coordination Facility at Jask, The planning and communications node that had managed the 3-vessel deployment was struck by 2 JASSM-ER missiles at 8:17 a.m. The facility was assessed as rendered inoperable. The IRGC Navy's Maritime Special Operations Unit staging area at Keshem Island received GBU-39 small-diameter bomb impacts from F-35. A's between 8:21 a.m. and 8:29 a.m., addressing the vehicles, equipment, and buildings that supported the unit's operations. The maritime program that had built and deployed 3 Q ships over 18 days had been addressed at its source in 15 minutes of strike execution. At 9:44 a.m., the post-engagement summary reached the 5th Fleet's commanding officer. The 3 Q ships had been eliminated. Their weapons had not fired. The surface combatants they had targeted were unaware of the specific nature of the threat that had been addressed on their behalf. The modification program that had produced the Q ships was destroyed. The coordination infrastructure was rendered inoperable. The maritime security corridor through which commercial shipping continued to transit the Persian Gulf was intact, its protective function uncompromised. The commercial vessels that were genuinely carrying cargo between ports, continuing their transits with the protection that the 5th Fleet had been providing since the conflict's 2nd week. In the Gulf, commercial shipping continued to move. Tankers, container vessels, bulk carriers, their AIS positions updating, their manifests legitimate, their cargoes real. The vessels that had been disguised as commercial shipping were no longer in the Gulf. They were debris on the bottom of the Persian Gulf, or, in the case of the small tanker whose propellant had detonated, a dissipating cloud of particulate and vapor that the Gulf's currents were distributing without meaning. The gap between commercial traffic volume and available boarding capacity still existed. It would always exist. What had changed was the evidence about what the IRGC was willing to put inside that gap, and what the American surveillance and response architecture was willing and able to do about it before the gap could be exploited. The P-8A crew, whose acoustic profiling pass had identified the 3rd vessel, received no acknowledgement of the significance of that 16-minute data review. Operational security precluded the distribution of the full engagement context to all participants. The crew filed their routine patrol report, noted the acoustic anomaly they had flagged, and were not told how that flagged anomaly had contributed to what happened at 7:33 a.m. They would learn later, in the classified debrief that accompanied the Night Watch program's post-operation review, that the 16 minutes of careful data analysis on day 11 had been one of 3 data points that built the definitive identification of the 3rd vessel. The analyst who had done that work accepted the information the way professionals in her field accept it, with a nod, a note in her log, and a return to the ongoing work of watching the Gulf for the next anomaly that needed to be seen. The IRGC had invested 18 days and 3 vessels in an operational concept designed to exploit a structural feature of maritime commerce. The concept had been sound. The 11-day intelligence advantage had been decisive. In naval warfare, as in all warfare, knowing what is coming is not merely an advantage. It is, when the geometry of the engagement is this compressed, the only thing that matters.